Well, hello. So my name is Gregory Jenkins. Some of you may know me. I'm the director of the Somerville Arts Council for the city of Somerville. And I want to just thank you all very, very much for coming out tonight to this meeting. It's been a good culmination of a year's worth of work that, that we've been doing. I just want to thank the task force that we put together about a year ago, who came together over 12 meetings. The number of different people between, you'll see on the slide the members later, but I just want to thank them very, very much for all their time and their effort in this work. And I also want to thank, obviously, MAPC, who's our host tonight. They came along. I don't know if you know them. They're sort of a regional consortium commission that deals with planning in the region. And there is an arts and cultural staff. And this is the majority of who you're going to be seeing tonight too. So we've worked with them in the past. They've been great to work with. And the culmination of this work and the report that we have of this work, MAPC was the primary ones driving the writing, the analysis, the work, and I just want to thank them very much. And again, I just want to thank you as an audience and tons of individuals. I know, my 20 years of working in Somerville, having conversations about arts and space and zoning, and I know sometimes I go on, but I just want to thank you all very much for those conversations. A lot of you know who you are. But I do appreciate it, and providing a sounding board, to my work, to the community's work. I think it's incredibly important. So, but without further ado, I'd like to introduce. This is our first time of hosting and introducing our new mayor, Mayor Katiana Ballantyne just came on, I think, maybe 2.5 weeks ago. So maybe she's 17 days in. A lot of you know her as a city councilor up in Ward 7, various committees she's been involved with. I've had the opportunity to work with her as a city councilor, and looking forward to working with her as our new mayor in 2022. So I just want to say thank you very much, Mayor Ballantyne, and I'll turn it over to you. And it's a great crowd we've got tonight. So thanks again for coming out, everyone.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody. We're up to like 175. That shows you how much arts and community and culture are important to Somerville. I want to thank MAPC. Oh, well, I should start out. Thank you for being with me on my 16th day, my first time ever, 16th day as first-time mayor of Somerville. So I also want to thank MAPC for partnering on this important work, and everyone here who supports arts and community. The task force and all your efforts over this past year. And it's so important that you are engaged, that you're here, and that you speak up. I want you to know that arts are the core part of Somerville's identity. It provides so many benefits. It gives us ideas, it gives us reflection, it gives us feeling, it gives us inspiration, and it does also fuel our local economy. I want you to know that I know that the arts thrive the most when arts are supported. And I intend to be sure that arts and our artists and makers thrive in Somerville. During my first days in office, I will say that I have reached out to OSPCD and really trying to understand the space issues here. We're working on things. I want to ensure that our staff in my office are working to advance the goals. Putting some systems and meetings in place. I'm also, talking to other mayors around the country. I also had some conversations today with the National Endowment of the Arts. We also like to do data and tracking of this issue to inform our efforts and understand the impacts. There are so many different ways to promote arts and culture in Somerville, And one of them is by supporting the preservation and the creation of artist space. I understand that this is under a tremendous amount of pressure, and I'm well aware of the loss at Central Street and Artisan Asylum and other threats. So I thank the task force for their findings, but I want to note that this is only the beginning. We're eager to listen and to learn. And I also want to let you know that while I can't stay for the full meeting, my Chief of Staff, Nikki Spencer, will remain for the rest of the meeting to report back on your needs and your concerns. And I look forward to continuing our conversation and this work with you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. Thanks for attending. What I'd like to do too is now introduce, well, I guess Anna's could introduce, but I'll introduce the Executive Director of MAPC, Mark Drazen, which is really great to have him here. I've met him once. It's great to have him here. So without further ado, I'd just like to turn it over to Mark, who'd like to make a few comments as well.
Greg, thank you so much. I had no idea that I was going to make any comments this evening, which is why I'm not wearing a dress shirt. I hope people will forgive me for that. I want to thank the members of the task force, the mayor, the department staff in Somerville who worked with us, and of course, our staff. I know that Annis, of course, has been deeply involved in this effort, and prior to her ascent as executive director, our founding director of the Department of Arts and Culture, Jen Erickson. Claudia Zarazua has been a key staff member working on this project. Earlier in the project, Dan Koff, who's no longer at MAPC, also assisted in the project. And Emma Bost, who is another member of our staff, and I believe is on the screen, although I don't see her at the moment. I want to thank the entire arts and culture staff for their work on this project. I have lived in actually the city of Boston my entire life. I'm a housing specialist, although I do broader work now. And throughout my life, working in the housing field and more recently in the planning field, the needs of artists, the constraints on their space for both housing and studio work has been an extreme issue that we've been focused on and dealing with here in Greater Boston. Every great region in the world can only aspire to be a great region if arts and culture are strongly represented in their work. And often it is said that the primary reason for that is the economy. You need the arts for a strong economy, and that's certainly true. But you also need it for a good life and for people to have joy and opportunities for expression and appreciation and to communicate with each other in meaningful ways, which is an extremely important thing, particularly in these difficult and challenging times. So figuring out ways to make sure that we can preserve space for artists to live and work is, I feel, a core function at MAPC, a reason why we're so glad to be involved in this project. And we hope that the findings of the task force will not only help to preserve and create space in Somerville, but will have generalizable lessons that we can put into effect throughout the region, throughout the Commonwealth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think now we're going to turn it over to Claudia, who's going to start this work. So we're going to get into the meat of the presentation and the meat of the work of the task force. So.
Sure. We do have a slide deck to share with you guys. Well, while that loads up, please make sure that you have renamed yourself, and we'll tell you more about why later on today. So we're all here to learn more about the work that we've been doing with the City of Somerville on the art space risk assessment. Next slide, please. Just to orient you about the flow of tonight's meeting, we've done welcome remarks. I will give you a quick overview of the project and the scope, and then we'll get into the meat of the work, the findings and recommendations, and what the city can do to protect art spaces. And then we'll get to the breakout group discussions, where we'll ask you to join in the discussion about what you've just learned and what are share your concerns. and share a couple of action items that you can take or that you would like to take to improve the situation in Somerville. Next slide, please. So first, we've asked, what brings you here? Are you an artist looking for space? Are you an organization concerned about losing your space? Are you a resident interested in just supporting the arts community? Are you a private developer working in Somerville? Or do you just have a general interest in artist workspace and beyond Somerville? Please rename yourself so we can find you when we do the breakout sessions. And if you're not sure how to do that, here's a quick instructions as how to do it, whether you're in mobile or desktop format. Next slide.
Or do you want to go backwards and show them that? Yeah.
Yes, so artist A, organization O, resident R, private developer D, and general interest G. And you can wear many hats. That's totally fine. Next slide. I'll hand it over to Greg.
So I think a lot of you know, and you're either, have been living with it personally, but obviously we've lost a lot of space in Somerville. The headlines are constantly, in discussion. I think we all know that sort of the market demands for land in Somerville and parts of Dorchester, areas where, for the most part, development may not have, approached us. Land is a hot commodity. We know that, the development is coming and you all have seen it and heard it, and it's happening, if anything, much more quickly over the past 2 years. Next slide, please. So within this context, we developed this, task force, and we came together. Again, there were members, I can try to remember all the task force. I thought we had a slide on this, but we had artist Risa Blattman, Randall Thurston, Callie Chapman, Stephen Flythe, artist in the community. Staff was Sarah Lewis from the planning department, Tom Galgani from economic development, myself, Kristen Selgis, who ran Somerstat, former councilor William White was on, Josh from the Planning and Zoning Board, also Stephen Gatlin from Winter Hill Bank was on the task force, and I'm probably missing some people, but anyway, what we came up with was a vision statement. I don't necessarily need to read all this, but trying to be as inclusive as we can as it relates to dedicating, looking at space dedicated throughout the city to support our artists and producers and living, working, sharing. So this was our sort of vision statement, which kind of guided the work for the past year. Next slide, please. And from that, we developed these guiding principles, and obviously sort of equity being embedded within all of these through the different sort of threads and values around accessibility, collaboration, creativity, preservation, and community. So these were our guiding principles that the task force had. Next slide, please. And I'll just turn this over. And so the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, as I mentioned before, and they work in a regional perspective, and each, our region works with that. I'll have Claudia or Anis, or, they can talk a little bit more about MAPC.
Thanks, Greg. And thank you to Mayor Ballentine and Mark Drayson for your opening remarks. It was really, it's wonderful to have your support in the framing of the regional impact of this work. Is obviously very important. My name is Anis Gupta. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I'm so pleased to be here tonight and to have had the opportunity to work on this exciting project. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture Department. The practice at MAPC launched in 2017 with generous support from the Barr Foundation. And we're here tonight to share the findings and recommendations from the work that we did with the Somerville Arts Council and the task force. I'll be presenting this work tonight with my colleague, Claudia Sausua, a regional arts and culture planner in the department, and want to again acknowledge the contributions of Daniel Koff, who's a former staff member who had served as a project manager. We also really benefited from the work of our analytical services team in the data services department. Lily Perkins High, Alyssa Kogan, and Joel Porterfeld led the analysis of development pressure and potential. Next slide. MAPC came to this project really with 3 aims. The first was to be able to take the lived experience of this artist displacement and quantify what is underpinning it, which is the impact of development pressure on arts organizations and artists in Somerville. The second was to make an estimate of the new space that might be generated through zoning set-asides for arts uses as part of the 2019 Somerville zoning ordinance, and also to recommend policy and program strategies that would help mitigate the displacement of arts spaces. Next slide. Before we dive into the findings and recommendations, which I do want to try to go through pretty quickly so that we have time for discussion, I want to acknowledge that the many working artists and arts organizations who are being impacted by this, and the reality is it's having a real impact on people's lives and livelihoods. And I just recognize that when you take this analytical perspective, it doesn't fully capture that lived reality. And so there may be some tension between the stress that's being experienced by the folks who are in Somerville and kind of the 10,000-foot view that is presented in some of these findings and recommendations. So, you know, I hope we can just all come together tonight and have a productive conversation and be kind of cognizant of that stress that's really affecting people on the ground. Next slide. So I do want to just, you know, bring in some group agreements for our conversations, that we want to be fully present, use our I statements, and share questions in the chat, and just remain muted during the presentation. We'll have some staff present to help moderate breakout rooms, as well as some of the members of the task force from Somerville. And any participant who is disruptive to the conversation will be removed from the meeting and will not be able to rejoin. All right, let's dive in. Next slide. So what is the arts-based risk assessment? It was a study that analyzes the impact of development pressure on artists and arts organizations and looks at how the city can respond to help artists thrive in Somerville. Next slide. So the first part of the assessment really used 3 criteria to quantify and aggregate the underlying conditions that contribute to development pressure. So this was demonstrated market interest, level of connectivity to transportation networks, and whether there's larger growth potential on the site that hasn't been built out yet. In combination, these really assume that these factors are part of what contributes to whether a site is likely to be redeveloped in the short term. In areas with higher connectivity and transportation access, areas that have already seen a lot more development, and parcels that haven't been built out are all more likely to see development happening. Next slide. So in combining all of these different factors, we're able to generate a map that shows the relative exposure to development pressure of every parcel in the city of Somerville, rated from 0, which is the lowest exposure to development pressure, all the way to 1, which is the highest. And all of this is sort of relative to what's happening in Somerville, not necessarily relative to the entire region as a whole. Next slide. And so then this map shows where arts and creative enterprises actually fall within that map of development, exposure to development pressure. And if you look only at the organizations that are in the high and highest categories of exposure, you're already looking at over 2.7 million square feet of building space. These are buildings that house those organizations. Due to limitations of our data set, we don't have the actual square footage of each organization. And the next slide. So zooming in a little bit further, this map shows where the artist studio spaces are. And so this was really a core set of data points for this study, looking at where artists are working. These are some of the hardest to count because they're sometimes informally organized, but they are where arts production happens, and they are generally at higher risk of being priced out, even from higher revenue uses that are part of the creative economy and creative enterprises. Next slide. So in fact, if you look at some of the really important studio spaces in Somerville, they are distributed across all levels of exposure to development pressure. And it's not really predictive of where a place may end up closing or artists losing space, because even low amounts of development pressure during these periods of economic growth can actually prompt the displacement of artists from the city. It really sort of emphasizes the urgency of this issue and the need for strategies to address that specific issue of loss of artist space. Next slide. And then this was, of course, echoed in responses to our survey. We saw art space as one of the key issues that folks in Somerville were looking for the city to start helping to address. And within that, more than half were identifying creative studios specifically as an area that the city needs to be focused on. Next slide. And then, thinking back to that underlying cross-cutting theme of equity, this was another piece of the puzzle where we heard the importance of increasing equitable access to art space, and also that arts organizations are really looking to get support to better serve Somerville's artists and residents of color. Next slide. So on the flip side of this is this need for, or that there's an opportunity to actually create new art spaces in Somerville. And our analysis estimates that more than 275,000 square feet of space dedicated to arts and creative enterprise uses will be generated by the development pipeline, which is not yet permitted buildings that are coming up in Somerville. Next slide. So that number is calculated from arts and creative enterprise use set-asides that are included in current development proposals or estimated as a requirement based on underlining zoning and proposed project square footage. I'm going to let Claudia take over from here. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so what we're looking at right now is the map of set-asides. You'll see the little dots, purple hue dots, that just denotes the amount of space that can be dedicated to arts and creative enterprise uses. And then you'll see the parcels identified with either the bluish hue or the sand color. Next slide, please. So what is an ACE? Create use set aside. I realize that we're going to be talking about zoning, and zoning can be sometimes very technical. So just asking a little bit for your patience as we walk you through some of the zoning definitions. So an arts and creative enterprise set aside. Can you go to the next slide, please? Is defined as follows: the artisanal production, arts exhibition, art sales or services, and more. Next slide, please. If you look into detail as to what each use is, you'll see that co-working and software development sometimes can be in conflict with arts uses. And you'll also note that we don't have art studios included in here. Next slide, please. So as you'll see, as ACE uses, mix artistic uses with co-working and innovative uses. This is a conflict because the current set-asides state that all ACE uses can be eligible to fulfill those set-asides. That means that if a private developer wants to dedicate that 5% set aside for ACE use, could go to a co-working space versus an art studios. Next slide, please. So we propose that the city amend the ACE uses definitions and categories. First, separating arts and artisanal and innovation, further defining what arts means to include arts exhibition, arts education and training, work-live creative studio, and artist studios. And then we recommend that under innovation, that covers co-working, shared workspaces, and design services. Next slide, please. To further protect arts and artisanal uses, we recommend that the eligibility to fulfill that set aside excludes innovation, so that that set aside can only go to arts and artisanal uses. Next slide. No, if we missed a slide. Emma, can you go back? Thank you. In addition to that, we recommend that the city uses what it's called in planning world a density bonus. This bonus would allow developers to build larger buildings, either taller or a larger footprint, if they agree to include more art spaces than what it is already required by the zoning ordinance. Next slide, please.
The other piece of this equation is the availability of living spaces for artists and living spaces that are affordable and support the work that artists are doing. Next slide. So in addition to the recommendations above, we also recommend that the zoning definitions actually align creative work live studio definitions, existing artist live workspace definition that was used to set up the artist live workspace program, and to allow creative studios in more zoning districts with housing by right. Next slide. What does that mean, aligning these two definitions? So creative work live, which is what's in the 2019 zoning, is defined as creative studio space of up to one room, including an area for accessory living, where work needs take precedence over quiet expectations of residents and neighbors in the building. It's allowed by special permit only in particular places, and it requires that there be shared kitchen bathroom facilities by floor. And then artist live workspace was defined as a building or portion thereof of at least 750 square feet used by the occupant for both residential use and artist studio space. And it was allowed by right in the Union Square Arts Overlay District when it was 6 units or less, and it required artist certification. So these are two different, very different definitions that then become difficult to bring together in actually implementing the artist live work development potential. So next slide. So we would recommend trying to find a way to bring those two together, and then also allow creative studios in more zoning districts with housing. So allowing creative studios as a home occupation in areas that are zoned for residential uses, including the mid-rise districts 4, 5, and 6, and also to allow an amended creative work live use by right in districts that allow for mixed residential and commercial uses. Next slide. So this question then comes back to one of affordability. What are the strategies that Somerville can use to maintain affordable spaces for artists? Next slide. To answer this question, we turn to some case studies. And so the Community Arts Stabilization Trust in California is an example where there are programs that actually subsidize rents for artists at $150 to $2 per square foot per month. They acquire properties through public-private partnerships, preserve arts uses in perpetuity through deed restrictions, and bundle leases for arts organizations to sustain affordable rents. Now, this is a lot, and it's not something that's going to happen directly out of this study, but next slide. One place that Somerville can start is to establish a municipal fund that would support building acquisition or rent subsidies to preserve affordability. And where would that money come from? Next slide. You would potentially be able to pool in lieu payments from developers who might opt into a provision to buy out their ACU set-aside requirement. And if it may, in fact, reduce the space created from these set-asides, but some of those spaces may not actually be well suited to the needs, meeting the needs of artists. Next slide. So for example, a third of the not yet permitted developments that are slated in 2 of the districts, the commercial core and mixed mid-rise 5 districts, actually generate set-asides that would be each less than 1,000 square feet. Next slide. And doing an optional in lieu payment approach for those smaller parcels, those smaller projects, could support a more tailored approach to addressing affordability. So those 4 developments in total would generate about 2,450 square feet. And if you used like a 10-year time frame taken from the open space in lieu payment and zoning, and make some estimates as to how much lab space would be per square foot versus art space, just that alone would generate 1.7 million in lieu payments to kind of seed a municipal fund to support affordability in arts for art spaces. Next slide.
Thank you. So these recommendations are great, but take a lot of effort and time to implement. So what can the city do to make sure that these programs support the local arts community now? Next slide, please. One of the things that we recommend is first developing a database of artists and arts organizations who are interested in finding space. Next slide, please. One of the case studies we found in our research from London in the UK, it's the Cultural Infrastructure Toolbox. It's a knowledge hub that has several resources, including landlord advice, an interactive map of vacant spaces, funding resources for rent support, legal counsel, and many more. This, next slide, please, could be implemented by leveraging existing resources. If you go to the City of Somerville's website, the Economic Development team under OSPCD already has some infrastructure that relates to matching small business owners with commercial real estate. So leveraging those resources and that infrastructure so that it applies to arts and arts organization. Next slide, please. So we need to acknowledge that some artists are facing displacement at higher rates. How can the city increase equity of access to both new and existing art spaces? Next slide, please. As we go back to the Cultural Space Task Force and its membership, we recommend that the membership is expanded to include more representation from communities of color and those that have been historically marginalized. This new composition of the task force can help with the implementation of these recommendations to ensure that equitable access to art spaces is at the forefront. This new task force can oversee potentially the new municipal art space fund that Anne has just talked about, and it can help foster relationships with the arts community and the city. Next slide, please. Building on that, we recommend that the Arts Council works and establish a closer relationship with the new Office of Racial and Social Justice. Next slide, please. We've learned from other places, in this case in Seattle, that this type of collaboration can really leverage the resources for the benefit of those community members and arts organizations that have been historically unable to reach these resources. This program, the BASE program, Build Art Space Equitably, creates a cohort of community members, ambassadors, let's say, that are trained on real estate development through a racial equity. And then they go into the community, share those resources, share that knowledge so that they can further protect and incentivize the creation of equitable space. Next slide, please. All right, before we get to the breakout discussion, I want to take a moment to see if there are questions, clarifying questions. I know we covered a lot. If you want to raise your hand, and Sasha can let you unmute yourself. Don't see anyone, or yes. I'm trying to get to Diana.
Hello. Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm a resident in Somerville and also an urban planner. I was wondering, you said that the 5% requirement for new development to provide artist or creative space only applied to commercial development, and I was wondering if I understood that correctly, it's not something that's required of new residential development, and it seems like given the amount of residential use we're getting here, those types of buildings should also be required to provide artist space.
I mean, I can comment, Diane. The set-asides for the most part are in what's considered the transformational district. So typically it is residential. However, within Boynton Yards, which is a larger sort of master development, we have like a 10% set aside. And so that would be affecting the residential, but the core zoning is mostly about the set asides for commercial space. There's already, 20% inclusionary within larger residential developments. And one of the recommendations here is to try to align this artist live workspace back to what we used to have. And I don't know if folks may know, but we do have 8 inclusionary artist live workspaces in 2 different developments in the previous zoning. So hopefully that clarifies things.
Thank you, Greg. I see 2 other hands. Mike?
Sure, thanks. I'm a resident and artist, mostly musician. And I was just curious about a lot of the terminology that's been used so far is about artist space and artist studios. And I think there's like a pretty big difference in needs between different types of art and the sort of architectural requirements for space that could be used for visual art versus sculpture versus performance versus music, and sound concerns, noise complaints, and things like that. And I guess my question is, how is the research sort of splitting out these very different needs from sort of the overall umbrella term of artist space?
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, Annis brought up the ACE definitions, and part of the ACE definitions, I mean, in the zoning, it doesn't really get caught up in genre-based types of ACE uses. But I saw that in the chat too, but it would include performing arts, musicians. So I think to me, the idea of getting ahead of this policy and to create both a space finder situation and understanding the development as it occurs sooner would be able to work with the developer and to say, what are the needs within the community, and maybe there needs to be more, music studio space, and we know that for a fact, and maybe potentially in that build out, and it could be accommodated to be soundproof or things like that. So it could be another once space, a performance facility. It could be just a music rehearsal studio. It could be a sound studio. It could be, visual art studios. So all of that's included. But I think the point of this is to get ahead of it, to be able to create matches that make sense as it relates to the development. And as Annis brought up, some of these may or may not make sense. And then how do we use a payment in lieu of to be able to take that money and then maybe bundle it towards other projects that make sense? If that answers your question.
I see 3 hands raised. I'm just looking at the time. I think we have time for 5 more minutes. I'll see Wig.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, hi, everybody, and hi, Greg. You know, I've been worried about this for 20 years and wondering why artists and garage startups weren't part of the Community Preservation Act for that whole time. And I brought reclamation artists to Assembly Square more than 20 years ago, twice. I brought the Mystic River to Art Beat at Davis Square with Cecily Miller and Susan Versler, and Cecily was fired for that, and Greg now sits in her job. So I am a little concerned at the lack of attention to garage startups who may not be artists, but are creative and may be starting up on, chump change. And Somerville has had a huge number of those as well. And honestly, I think of them as part and parcel of the small creative economy as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I can comment on that. In looking at the ACE definitions where we said that we were trying to go ahead and demarcate something that goes from pure sort of art studio all the way to innovation, I think for us to be able to support whether it's a garage startup, which to me in my mind is more of an innovation type of thing, I think there's a need to call it what it is, and then we start to delineate this. In my mind, I think a little bit of the Summer Nova complex, I mean, that's within a fab district, and maybe we just say, it's no longer really going to be an artist space. It's mostly an innovation space. Those are sort of comments that I keep thinking about, but I think in order to examine what you're going to support, we have to honestly define what these uses are. And this is the point of this work, is to basically define these uses, derive more clarity in uses as it relates to planning and zoning. So I think this is just a start for that. But obviously we want to support the startups. I mean, everyone knows iRobot was here, and Artist Asylum, we helped start like at a 5,000 square foot space, and they went to 40,000. So yeah, there's room for that. Maybe one more question, and then the point of the breakouts too is that we want you all to kind of gather in groups of maybe 10 to kind of address some of these issues that you're thinking about, and then come back and quickly report. And then this will be recorded, and I think it'll help us to kind of spur on the next steps of trying to understand, how 180 people that are in this room, how I can try to work with them, and the next steps that we can do. So maybe one more question. I don't know.
Yes,
Melissa.
or Julia, I just want to note that the questions that we don't get to cover today, we'll be sharing with you via email after this conversation. So please keep typing your comments and questions into the chat, and we'll keep those recorded. So Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having this. I'll try to be quick. I'm gonna go back to what Mike was saying. And what I'm trying to understand is like, how will this be defined? So if you're working with a developer, they have their own agenda, their own interests, and they probably wanna spend the least possible on this. Who is there to advise them, to explain the needs, the specific needs for each and every type of art, such as music, such as dance, such as visual arts, gallery space, it has specific needs. It has to have lighting. It has to have, the most neutral possible space. So dance space needs to have a flooring that is for that and whatnot, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
How do we talk to these people so we get, good spaces and not just like a brick wall and like concrete floor, which for a gallery is good, for dancers is not, for instance, right?
I mean, I think that's the whole discussion about sort of starting this issue of having specific conversations as these developments come online. I mean, every type of space has its own sort of what they, call health and safety, standards. And so different spaces have different types of standards. So whether you're doing a lab development or residential development, you have these minimum standards. So it's just a matter of us getting in front of this early enough and understanding that, and then matching it with what the community need is. I mean, that's the work that has to be done. So,
and will this be through the Somerville Arts Council then? Is that what I am understanding?
I mean, at this point, it would be through the city. So we need to determine how that's going to happen.
So a representative would be great. So someone that is dedicated for this.
Correct.
Mhm.
Greg, I would just add, so we didn't include some of the recommendations that were much more internal, but we did have quite a few in the report that relate to how this work might get done in terms of how you staff it, potentially in the Somerville Arts Council, but also increase in coordination and collaboration with the Arts Council and the Office of Planning and Strategic Planning and Community Development, and thinking through how all of these development decisions are getting made and where artists can have a voice in that. So yes, it's definitely something we considered and addressed in the report, but kind of wanted to take a little bit of a step back to the bigger picture for tonight.
Can we
And
ask?
actually, that makes me, what we're going to move on from this, but why don't we post a link to the actual full report? It's still in draft mode. And what we're going to do is hopefully within 2 weeks, come together and sort of finalize this. But if you all have comments on this, but we'll put the link to the draft, to the report that Anis is referring to. But why don't we move on before we start losing a lot of people? Claudia, do you want to go back and post those 3 questions that we want you all to do?
Yes.
And I do think the individual conversations will be important.
Sure. So I'm just going to share it with you. We'll go into breakout sessions. We ask that you please find a moderator. We have staff that are tasked to help us moderate, but we're not sure we'll have enough. So if you don't see someone identifying as staff, please designate a moderator that can help guide the discussion on these 3 questions. You can either share one action that you can take to improve artist and arts organizations' access to space. You can share one recommendation that the city should prioritize. So what we've heard today and what you think should be prioritized, or just share one issue or concern that was not addressed in the presentation today. We ask that someone else takes notes in a document that we'll be sharing with you, and we'll share back, we'll come back to the main room and share the main, in 30, 60 seconds, like the main topic of conversation in each one of your groups. We'll share those questions with you in each room, and they're in the chat too. So
what's going to happen is that somebody's going to assign you to a breakout room. That's why we wanted you to analyze this. So
right.
I think Claudia mentioned if you can take about 7 to 8 minutes, and then we'll bring you back to the larger group to have specific report backs. Okay.
Now I want to give an opportunity for the moderator, note takers in your group to share back what you heard. We have a few minutes. We please try to be as brief, as concise as possible. And I'll first ask if anyone, we were cut off right as we were going to choose a person to report back. Anyone in my group wants to volunteer, raise your hand, and we'll let you unmute yourself. All right, I don't see anyone.
I'll report. We had a good session or good discussion, and it mostly Robert Goss, who is one of the founders of the Brick Bottom community too, was there. And it really revolved around the issue of looking at time and space with different development pressures. And it was interesting to have a conversation. Tom Galgani was also there. Even though there's all this sort of lab development pressure now, it could really shift in another 2 or 3 years. And we're sort of in this inflection point right now. But it was interesting to sort of talk about the pressure that's going on now compared to when Robert Goss and the folks at Brick Bottom, came in and bought this building for $250,000, very little funds for what all of it was. Sadly, Scott got cut off. I think some of the breakouts were a little short, but there was not really a ton of specifics. Lee Kilpatrick was there. He also is with Washington Street Art Center and gave us a little bit of an update on the pressures there. But there weren't specifics other than saying that there's so much detail to this, and hopefully folks will, want to see more action items that they too can come to. And I think that puts us on, on the Arts Council to do that.
Thank you, Greg. I think we didn't have enough time to go over all these
Yep.
feelings and, very valid concerns about the situation. So please, everyone, feel free to share your concerns and or comments in the chat. If you didn't get to share that in your group, we'll try to monitor the chat to bring those up. I would like to just share what was discussed in my group very briefly. Some people are concerned about making sure that resources and engagement is truly considering the needs of the communities of color, and truly that those needs are truly identified by them. Some people, others in my group were concerned about having or just recommend that the city takes creative solutions such as the bow market. And some artists in my group were also concerned about how can the city cater resources for the different types of arts uses and artists, artists versus those that have a hobby and do not live off of this specific use versus organizations. And just another last thing, and recommend the city to increase their transparency and enforcement of these issues. I would like to go over to one of our fellow staffers to see what they want to share. Anyone?
So for our group, I'm just going to pass it over to Greg Dukes, who's going to report out for our team. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, got it. So the overarching idea from our theme is that there's a limited amount that we can do as individuals, but collective action is really going to be key, whether that is sort of forming a collective action committee, working with city planners or the city of Somerville to help enforce some of these new policies and districts, or even looking at, who can we put in the conversation, folks that are in the know when we're talking about these big biotech developments or these new developments that are coming in, bringing more voices to the conversation when it's saying, hey, we should add a theater or a art space or a gallery space to this venue. How many voices can we get in the room? How can we empower people to be an advocate for our community and put them in positions of power where they can advocate for all of us?
Thank you, Greg. Anyone else that wants to report back, please raise your hand. It's easier to find you.
I can report if you like.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
So we had a great conversation, and I think people are really looking for specificity. What does art space mean? And can it be broken down more in terms of genres so that the art space and the set-asides better reflect different types of genres? And also, how can we make sure that it's art, like what is creative space? Like that could get sucked up by tech. So how can we assure that it will remain art space? And people are worried that an innovation district, because it's called innovation, could push out artists, and just because it's large, and people are worried about that. And what else? How do we assure these spaces will be good spaces? Affordability, how can we assure that these spaces, even if they are turned into artist spaces, artists might get priced out quickly? Could we do something like enact a rent control system? Could artists potentially be stakeholders? And people brought up Brick Bottom. Brick Bottom has security because it is owned by artists. So if there was a way in which artists could become owners or co-owners, that would also, it would preserve longevity, hopefully, and it would also build equity on the part of the artists. And the potential of low interest loans. And also, if a building is going to potentially go on the chopping blocks, can artists be given a heads up so they can have enough time to organize to potentially buy the building? So those were some of the key points that came up.
Thank you. I see a couple of hands raised. Jessa? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry
Yeah,
about that. I think our group discussion basically echoes what other people have said and what is in the chat. A little bit more definition of what constitutes terminology. One of us is in the culinary arts. How does that fit in? Protection of existing spaces and the pricing out that people have already begun to experience, as well as the security of knowing simply that this space is going to continue being there. Then also we wondered about this arrangement with developers, perhaps giving too much power to them culturally, financially, and politically. How can other players be brought into the picture that would balance this out? So that's all I've got to report.
Thank you. I see quite a few hands. I'll get to all of you, try to get to all of you. Abby?
Hi, everyone. I'm reporting back for Breakout Group 15, and some new things that haven't been voiced yet, but that were voiced in our group. We're working with artists first to create an artist-driven, artist-created neighborhood or community plan that really builds out, like, this is exactly, if we have all the stars aligned, what we need and what we want, and then bring that to developers instead of just kind of starting with the pool of money and seeing what can be made with that pool of money. And then another one was about increasing signage and wayfinding in Somerville so that people know where artist studios are, and that it just becomes a lot more inherent that they exist and that this is a vibrant community. And then looking for consistent funding opportunities beyond linkages. If linkages aren't doing enough, either A, how can we get the most out of them as possible? And then B, if they're not doing enough, what are other consistent, stable, guaranteed funding mechanisms that can be discovered?
Thank you. Jonah.
Hi. Reporting for Group 18. A lot of what I have to say has been said, so I'll just try to tag it and move on. But certainly concerns about affordability, acknowledgement that some developers may be willing to subsidize to make things affordable. That's great, but that's probably not true in every case. Enforcement of appropriate artist use. What's the mechanism for that? Certification or some other means. Suitability of the space itself for the different uses that are needed, which was covered quite a bit earlier. Thanks, Mike. And mechanisms possibly needed beyond these set-asides. There's a lot of potential with these set-asides, but I wonder if some city action to make sure that actually all the needs are met, catalog the spaces that are needed and figure out how we're going to meet them, and maybe set-asides can get us part of the way, but there may be more needed beyond that.
Thank you, Jonah. Next up, Heather.
Hi there. We had a really great discussion in our group, and there are three different takeaways. One is kind of the theme was strengthening relations within our community, especially with property owners, and doing like a matching system, because there's a lot of empty buildings because of COVID. And I know the Arts Council is already kind of utilizing that and has a really lovely model over at Art Assembled. And I know the plan is to be able to strengthen our database system and to kind of make sure that we have, like a robust system to find out, like, okay, we have these properties available, who was looking for space and what are those needs are. So identifying that. So that's one resource, and kind of trying to figure out and develop better toolkits. Is there a restaurant that wants to host art exhibits, and how would they do that? And are there these toolkits like kits available that can really highlight and strengthen art within the community all over the and so that was one. And then the issue as far as music performance spaces, there's a lot of successful restaurants already that are doing great music series like Sally O'Brien's. Are there any hurdles that we may be unaware of that might make other restaurant owners be apprehensive in even starting or even investigating that process? Is it noise issues? Is it something that is it any policies or zoning that is it too residential? Is there not enough soundproofing? And if they are interested in it, is there resources available that can help them get there so we can kind of preserve our music spaces? So that was another one. And to kind of echo some of the other issues that were going on is the existing studio spaces that are there. Strengthening the relationships with studio landlords, and can we provide them tax incentives to be able to keep the spaces that we have? That would be, that might be something to consider. And also there is a push to make tenants' right to first refusal a reality across the state. And that is mainly focused on residential property. It doesn't really kind of identify commercial property. And can that also be in tandem to artist studio spaces? And, case in point of Central Street, if those artists aren't able to buy their building, then maybe a nonprofit could buy it in their stead. So something like that, having like similar mechanisms like the 100 Homes program to be able to kind of give artists a little bit more of a leg up, because it is a financial burden for them to buy a property on their own, especially a large commercial building. So those are the three things that kind of came up.
Thank you. I still see quite a few hands, and just looking at the time, so I just ask that try to be a little bit concise and brief about your takeaways. And if we don't get to you, please feel free to share in the chat. Emily.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am reporting for my group. I have no idea what our group number is. We were talking about making sure that the city is committing to buildings that are already in place. That came up in terms of maybe temporarily letting empty building spaces become artist spaces, and there's room for that, or precedence for that in Berlin. Same thing with allowing, instead of making new buildings, using the ones that already exist and converting them to artist spaces. But the number one priority was rewriting the zoning. I feel like the set-asides are great, but may not be effective at all unless there's something really strong that's rewritten into the zoning moving forward. Everything else has pretty much been said, so I will close right with that.
Thank you. Peter.
Hi, I'm reporting for Group 7. I think most of the focus was on carrying through with linkage promises. I think they'll quote Jane Sherrill, who said, 2 or 3 studios to satisfy a requirement does not make a community. I thought that was somewhat astute, but most of the focus was on how do you make sure there is ongoing support. And it shouldn't really be the developer making the decisions, that there should be some other entity that really ensures that this is a vital art space that continues and grows and has strength. Some part of that was really focused on what assurances are there in terms of controlling the rent and making sure that there's really a long-term commitment, and it's not just treated by the developer as some hurdle they have to get over to get their building up.
Thank you, Peter. Lauren, and then Emiliano, and then Mike.
Hi there. So we talked about spaces that are in Somerville. Some are too expensive or in bad condition, or sort of they don't have the amenities that people need, like public transportation. However, there are spaces in Somerville, and Adi had a great suggestion of making those spaces somewhere in a database that spells out their specs, what the kind of space they are, how much they cost, so that people who are searching for spaces can find them. There's another great point about not relying on private landlords like Rogers Foam, who owns Vernon, to preserve artist spaces, right? So somebody in an earlier group made the idea of artists having ownership, and I think that that's a really important one. And then we did not get to talk, Richard Wood started to share about having to move his arts-based business outside of Somerville. So it would be interesting to know what we have already lost in the city. All right, I will stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Emiliano.
Hi, everyone. So some of the ideas that were brought up in my group were expanding the hours of operation of places that already support the arts. So for example, the Somerville Media Center could potentially change their hours for it to be a little bit more accessible to artists that work like a 9-to-5 job. So either going in earlier in the day or going in later at night, which is when usually artists are more, especially musicians, are more alive at night. Again, just putting emphasis on taking advantage of all the vacant areas in Somerville. Someone put in the chat, the Star Market, that's on Broadway in front of the Citizens Bank. That would be a great space for studios and performance areas. Also taking advantage of the new beautiful high school, huge high school that was built outside of school hours. It could become a spot for artists as well. And in terms of the high school, being involved with artist youth outreach, involving the youth in the selection process of the art that's brought into Somerville, as well as the production side of things. Let's see, it's based on the conversations, it seems like there's a lot of pressure on the artists to be involved, which is fine, because if we're not going to stand up for ourselves, no one else will. But because of that, I know there was a Facebook group created recently regarding some type of artist union. So the mission there is to give artists a voice and collective power. There's a ton of other Facebook groups too that you can join and kind of like band together. And doing a little bit more outreach for minority artists and advertising a little bit more the possibilities that BIPOC people, minorities have to receive grants, to put on shows. In the maps that were shown earlier, it seemed like a lot of East Somerville, was very neglected with art or artists. So doing a lot of minority outreach as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliano. Mike?
Sure, thanks. I'll make it quick. I'm reporting back from group 11, a lot of great points that have already been raised here, so I won't reiterate those, but one that came up that is actually kind of popping up in the chat right now is the city's responsibility and city as landlord for certain buildings right now that are spec for artist space, but maybe aren't at capacity, or other buildings that are vacant in other ways, or basically just the city's responsibility and our responsibility to push not only against external pressures, but also on the city itself to fulfill the demand for artist space and to make the best use of the property that they currently own. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Emma?
Hi, reporting back for my group. So really echoing lots of what we've heard already, but we talked a lot about the mismatch between housing and the kind of supply and need issues there, and the urgency of that issue in terms of people being displaced, not only outside of Somerville, but potentially outside of the Boston region as well. Within that, we also talked a little bit about live workspace. The idea of repurposing vacant spaces in the city came up, as well as some of you have already noted. And again, just kind of that need for affordable housing and or live workspace, but the primacy of needing a community and needing people who can actually stay in place to have that arts community thrive.
Thank you. And last but not least, Salvatore.
Sorry, I had on mute there. Thank you. So I was in group 9. As a suggestion to the city, I guess, our group said that we should really refine what those definitions are in terms of, what's an artist, what's an innovation space. While it's important to not have all these, tough tech things like Greentown Labs kind of, taking over the city, you don't want to exclude places like Artisans Asylum, where I had my space before, because that was definitely a kind of a low financial commitment kind of space where people can get started and experiment and learn a lot and collaborate with people from different fields, whether they were, MIT types, engineers or fine artists or whatever. And also, as we were just starting to talk about when we ended the session, but one of the things that was in the presentation I thought was really interesting was talking about all these setbacks, they're called for these developers, that they're essentially a financial commitment for them to set aside 10% of their development for artist spaces. Well, why don't they pool all that? And why, instead of them designing it and them trying to, just have a few co-working spaces or whatever, is why doesn't the city manage that? And say, okay, let's take all this big pool of money, which ends up being a lot more when you start pulling it together and saying, okay, here's a space where we have rehearsal spaces, where we have, gallery spaces, where we have, workshops or whatever, and really get input from the community of artists that are already here to make something that's suitable for them. So I hope I represented that correctly. That's it.
Thank you. Anis and
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure. So my group had their voices heard. So I was group 16. There are it echoed a lot of these conversations of using underused spaces, focusing on like what's already here and supporting that. I will also just note that we did also hear about the impact of the pandemic. And so that arts organizations that have space and have been wanting to, expand the use of their space for community groups and community use like Mudflat haven't been able to because of the pandemic. So it hasn't really come up, but just to note that we're still kind of in a period of flux, and that's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration as we think about moving forward.
Well, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts and concerns about this work and the sense of urgency on getting things moving. I would like to hand it over to Greg for some closing remarks and next steps. We'll be sharing resources in the chat about the report where you can see more of the recommendations. It's a lengthy report, but it does have an executive summary. We have a mailing list so you can sign up to stay informed in what comes next. And our contact information if you want to continue this conversation offline. So, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Anis and MAPC crew for leading this on. Yeah, I just want to thank all of you. There's, we've still got 100 folks in the room here. We're, like Claudia mentioned, we have all of your contact information because of the way in which you registered. We'll post a recording of this on our website as well. And what we can also do too is get some of the documentation out of the chat. I think we can do that and get it back to you. There's definitely a lot of things that came up that are, just so you know, that were addressed by the task force and were addressed in the report. And what I'd like to do is for us to try to reconvene, or let's take a look at this and start to understand after we go back to OSBCD and the mayor's office and start to tackle some of this and start to explain a little bit more back out to the community what we envision are going to be our next steps. But I do think this issue of like the database, again, understanding more about the different genre needs within space needs is going to be really key. The issue in Boynton Yards, I mean, in Boynton Yards itself, there's close to 90,000 square feet of space that are dedicated. So it's not, we're not talking 50 square feet, you know, we're talking a chunk of space. So some of these set asides in the larger development are going to produce a significant amount of space. And what we have to do is be prepared for that. How that gets worked out is, that's why we're here. That's why we're trying to examine all this. But this is where we're at, and you know, we can keep moving forward. There's definitely a lot of items about the work that we did. Some people were bringing up about the fabrication districts, the existing zoning, and the existing buildings in the fab district. Some of this we still need to explore and push further on in terms of how to protect those fab district buildings. So those are kind of things that we're going to be sort of looking at in the future, looking at how we're going to save and you know, keep the existing buildings we have, and yet how we're going to try to bring online new space that will be broad enough for, you know, musicians, gallery space, performance space, you know, visual art studios. So that's all of the work that we've got ahead. I mean, I would recommend, if you are really interested in this work and want to help me or participate with this and really want to be dedicated to it, send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat. I think most of you know how to reach me, but I'll put it in there. And, you know, let's continue this conversation. And if I can get this in the chat for some reason here, we'll just continue the conversation. And that's what we're planning on doing. I don't know, but again, thank you very, very much for coming out, and I really appreciate everybody's comments. Take a look at the report. It's a great report, and you know, let's keep in touch. We're not going anywhere. We're going to keep pushing on this. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Please take a look at the report. A lot of your concerns and comments touch on our recommendations that we did not get to share with you today. But please stay in touch. I'll post my contact information there too, if you have any questions about this work. Thank you again for coming.